This Choircast podcast is brought to you by the Quantum Gospel of Mary and the Lost Gospel of Truth by Keith Giles. For nearly 2,000 years, Mary Magdalene has endured attempts to erase her from the Gospel of John, suppression of her gospel text, and even false allegations by the 6th century Pope of being a prostitute. In this new book, author Keith Giles reveals the truth about Mary's gospel message and restores her prominence as the apostle to the apostles. Available now on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Damn. You've reached another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast, and we are exploring a story of two incredibly strong women in the Bible. It's called the Book of Ruth. And I can tell you that there's a lot of times that people will talk about the Bible as being patriarchal or misogynistic, and they're not wrong. They're not wrong. There are many places where that is the case because the culture was a patriarchal culture. But there are also many places where women are highlighted as strong, active agents in the story of God. And those places, there are many of them, are a direct sort of pushback against that patriarchal, misogynistic culture. It's a way that we actually can observe the Bible being this more progressive, pro-woman text, even though the culture is so different that it is possible for us to miss a whole lot of those references. And so we're in this moment in this story where Naomi is the mother-in-law of Ruth. Naomi and Ruth are destitute. They have nothing. All of the men in their life have died, which means they don't own things. They are very, very vulnerable to all kinds of injustice, both systemic and violent and just everything possible. And they are going to take a trek from Moab back to where Naomi is from, to Bethlehem. And just to say that trip was harrowing, to be sure. They are not safe. They do not have the protections that are generally in place when they have men in their lives. They are going to have to walk from town to town, and when they get into those towns, they are going to have to stay in the homes of strangers. You can imagine how dangerous that has to be. And yet, none of that passage from one location to another is explored or told in this story. At the end of the first chapter, it's really, in the original language, it's 6 words long. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's it. They leave Moab, which is Ruth's homeland, where Naomi had moved because there was a famine. And they're going to travel about 50 miles on foot. This long journey is not even referenced in the story because the story is not about the journey, right? The story is about what happens next. And what happens next is amazing. Okay, so we're going to start in Ruth chapter 2 in verse 1. The narrator begins with a little introduction that really puts all sorts of tension and questions in the air. It says, now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, if you remember, and nobody's expecting you to, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. So this person, Boaz, is part of Naomi's husband's family. Now, it's important to understand some sort of legal backstory here. In this part of the world, there was something called the kinsman redeemer. And I don't think that's what we have here with Boaz, but the idea was that there was a head of a household, and that head of a household was responsible for, dealing with any of the bad things that would happen to the family. If somebody was sold into slavery, they would have to go and buy that person back out of slavery, those kinds of things. And in this case, the kinsman redeemer would be expected to take care of Ruth and Naomi and to father a child by not Ruth, she's too old at this point, but to Naomi, and it would be treated as a child of Naomi's deceased husband. But that's an important context, because there's this idea that families and the men who are in these families are to sort of make sure that everything is okay, to be the protector, to be the redeemers, to be the people who help, even when the other men in the lives of these women are deceased or passed. And this is important because what this does is it sets this tension here. Okay, there's this guy named Boaz. He is connected to them, and he is rich. He is wealthy. And so it's not just another person in poverty. This person clearly has the ability to help Ruth and Naomi. So the narrator here, it sort of sets up this tension, gives you just enough about this guy Boaz to be like, I wonder what's going to happen there. And then it says, and Ruth the Moabite. Remember, it keeps reminding us that she is a Moabite, and this is written during a time when some of the religious leadership was saying, if you have a foreign wife, you should divorce her. Right, so it's constantly reminding us of the danger and really the racism that's happening at this time by saying Ruth the Moabite. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone whose sight I might find favor." Now, this idea of gleaning, it's not just people going and trying to pick things up. This is a system that was set up in this culture to help people who were hungry. Okay, so there's a couple of places in the Bible where you see this, but in one of those places is in the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, in chapter 19, starting in verse 9, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien," the outsider, the foreigner. "I am the Lord your God." So basically what happens is the edges, and eventually most of the people were thinking of this as the corners of their field. They wouldn't harvest those at all. And as they were harvesting, anything that fell to the ground, they were not supposed to pick up. And so this is a way that the people who were at most risk, the poor people and the foreigners, the people who show up in a city that is not their own, are not going to just die of starvation, right? This is a sort of social welfare kind of program where the people who have things are made by law to give those things to the people who do not have them. Right? The idea of the wealthier people using what they have to take care of the people who are poorer or are in need. It's every culture. And here it is like ordered by God, which is, I think, really important. It's really important that this sort of a system is seen not just as a governmental system, but as a divine system, like helping people who do not have all that they need is a holy act. It is what God wants for humanity. It's what God wants us to do. And I feel like in this moment, it's important to pause, because in the world right now, there are a lot of fundamentalists that talk about social welfare programs as if they are evil. They talk about it as if people are feeling entitled who shouldn't be entitled. You've got to work for what you get. But that's not most of the people that I'm referring to, that I hear these statements from, are claim to be Christians. So this story of Ruth would be part of their sacred text. And that's just in no way in line with that religious tradition, right? Christianity would never see a social welfare program, a program that takes care of the poor, as a problem. In fact, it would say that the codification of caring for the poor and the codification of the people who are more wealthy using what they have to care for the poor in an official statutory way, that is holy. That is the work of a person who believes in God. That is what God expects. And any sort of criticism of taking care of poor people and having some of what you have, if you have enough to do that, no, that's not in the cards. That's not something that you can support with the Bible or with the teachings of Jesus, for sure. What we see here in modern terms is some version of Ruth going and applying for food stamps, right? Taking advantage of the legal way that is that this society provides for people who don't have enough food. Yeah. But this was a little different in that Ruth was going to have to do some work, right? Yeah. And so we're going through this gleaning piece. It's important to say, though, that what's happening here, what the writer of the story is doing here, is not just like chronicling the events of this day, right? This is being structured in a just brilliant narrative way that holds suspense, that creates twists and turns. Yeah. And so Ruth asks permission to go and glean, and Naomi gives it. Now, as we've mentioned before, Naomi is in the final years of her life based on life expectancy of this time. And so it's not surprising that Naomi is not able to go with Ruth. But I think it's important to note that that Ruth, knowing that she is in danger as a foreigner, takes this initiative. Like this is courage. This is fully recognizing what's going on in your life, the desperate situation that you have, and realizing that in order to meet your needs, in order to meet the needs of your family, which is her and Naomi, you're going to have to put yourself at risk. You're going to have to put yourself in danger. She is a woman doing, most of the gleaners are going to be men. And most of the people in the field are going to be men. And so this single foreign woman is going to be put in a situation where she could be assaulted, just to put it bluntly. And she does it. She steps up. She asks Naomi, can I go glean? And Naomi says yes. And then she's going to walk out into a field and start bending over and gathering up scraps. And I think about my grandmother. My grandmother on my mother's side was a very strong woman. She was alive during World War II. And when her husband, my grandfather, went off to war, she was left at home and had to work. She went up and dealt with mail. She went up on a mountain or a hill in the town where they would drop it, and she would carry the mail for the town down. I think about my mom. My mom had to be the caregiver for well over a decade for her two parents while my mom was working, had two kids in school, one kid that went off to college. I mean, she was incredibly strong because there was a moment and that needed something of her, and she met that need with action that was difficult, action that was exhausting, and she did it for years. Yeah. These strong women in our lives that have provided so much for us. That's who we're looking at here with Ruth. We're looking at one of those women who is risking an enormous amount, who is going to engage in some very, very hard work. And it makes us, or it should make us reflect on where we are, right? Where we are personally. Like, am I in a situation where there's something that's going to need to be done? It's risky. Maybe it's a lot of work, but it's clear. It's clear what needs to happen, and I've just got to step up to the plate. I've got to take the risk. I've got to do the hard work, right? I've got to follow Ruth's example. Yeah. Or maybe even more on the nose, right? When the systems that are supporting the people that are in a situation similar to Ruth and Naomi in our world are being challenged. And it could be a risk for me to step up to that plate. It could be a risk for me to speak out and to say something. Could be hard work involved. question is, can I have the courage of Ruth? Yeah. Yeah, this is a moment, right? So in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, so she went, she claimed and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. And as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, remember, we know who Boaz is. Ruth has no idea who this is. And the narrator reminds us, the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Remember who this guy is. She just happened, and this is important, like the fields were not super delineated. There weren't walls in between the different crops of the different people. So it's very easy to cross from one field into another in the way that they dealt with this in this part of the world at this time. And then it says, just then, this sort of like this phrase is like almost like coincidental or just at the right moment, or can you believe it? Boaz comes from Bethlehem and he says to the reapers, he says in verse 5, to whom does this young woman belong? Now, if you are looking for the patriarchy, you are finding it right here, right? From our modern standpoint, you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, she belongs to someone. She is the property of someone. She belongs to someone, like the tools that these reapers are using belong to these reapers, right? That is how, that is the reality of her situation. And it's really important for us to remember that, right? That we're to think about a different culture, and these women were property. Okay. So we are seeing a very pro-woman story. We are also seeing the reality of this patriarchal systemic injustice that happens, right? To whom does this young woman belong? And it says, a young man who was in charge of the other reapers answered, oh, she is the young Moabite woman. Remember, Moabite should set off alarms. Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she's been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. The idea here is that she has worked harder than the men, right? The men have taken breaks. She has not. She has exhibited strength and dedication and the willingness to work beyond everybody else, right? That is the implication. Ruth is an impressive, hard-working woman. But this isn't being told to anyone. This is being told to Boaz, who we are constantly being reminded is a distant relative to Ruth, to Naomi, and then by extension to Ruth. And he is wealthy, and he has this field, and we are getting all of this. Like, does he realize what's happening? Does Naomi understand what's happening? Like, this is this drama, and then we see Boaz respond to Ruth in verse 8. Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Now, this is important because he's about to give her some extra privileges. He actually just did. And she could be in trouble if she did this in somebody's field who was not Boaz, okay? Because there's the rules for gleaning. It's set out in the Bible right there. There's the rules for gleaning. And she is going to get additional privileges, which is Boaz's right, obviously, to do. But he's like, hey, be careful. Do not glean in another field. I'm giving you permission to do this in my field. And he says, keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow them. The young women, and this is important, the way this worked is there were often young women workers as well. And the reapers would go and cut things down, the barley down. The young women would follow behind them, and they would tie them into sheaves that could be put on a truck. But that's the moment at which the most barley is going to be left on the ground. And so what he's saying is like, stick with the young women, go right behind them. You're going to get plenty. You're going to get more that you're not going to have to work from morning until night. Okay. I am taking care of you. This is this tender, beautiful, kind moment, right? Where Boaz, who he has learned is distantly related to this woman, is doing what he should do, honestly, right? But nobody's expecting this of him, right? He's not required to do this by law. And this is a moment that sort of is a mirror back to us. There are moments over and over in our lives when we can do the bare minimum, we can do what the law requires, or we can really use what we've got to help somebody. And we have that choice. Sometimes we do the right thing. Sometimes we don't. But the question is, when you look back on your day, have you followed Boaz's example here? Have I followed? But I know there's so many days that I don't. But the idea that like you could help this person, you've got what you need to help this person. And do you choose to do it or not? But he goes another step. He says that he has ordered the young men not to bother you. So now she is following under the care and protection of the owner of the field, right? You've got to imagine basically what Boaz has said to these young men is like, keep reaping. If you mess with her, you're out. You're not going to get to work here anymore, right? This is the implication here. And then even more, if you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. You don't have to even go draw your own water. This is so generous and so over the top. When you read it just on the face of it, it might not sound like a big deal, but it is. And you see it in her reaction. She falls prostrate with her face to the ground and thanks him profusely. And her response is not over the top, right? Her response is in line with what he has done. And we're in this moment in the story where it feels like things might be turning. And you're wondering like, okay, so what's going on with Boaz? Like, yes, he's now caring for, but he knows who she is. He knows who she is. And he's starting to do something about her state. Even though she's a Moabite, a foreigner, the person who should be being divorced by any of the men in her life, like that, this person. Yeah, he's not just being kind, he's risking his reputation. He's risking his status. Wow. This is a good guy. Wow. So much here so many positive examples for us to say, okay, I'm going to be like him. I'll tell you though, when you're trying to do that, it's really helpful to not be alone, to have people cheering you on and saying, yes, 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 you're right. This is right. Right. For a lot of people, that was church for them. And they've left the church because the church screwed them over. And a lot of people miss that. They miss the support of doing the right thing, right? It's actually why we have this thing called Not Church. And it's a place where people of all different religious identities come to talk about spiritual things, to talk about spiritual beliefs and practices and life and politics and their pets. It's an honest to God, wonderful community of people who are there for each other in the good times and in the bad times. We celebrate, and when people are going through it, we're there for each other. I think you'd like it. No, I think you'd really love it. I think it would nourish your soul, right? We do that. We do the weekly Zooms. We're starting to plan some in-person gatherings. And the deal is, all of us have experienced being tricked out of our money by churches. And so we don't do the donation thing. We don't ask for some percentage. We just ask people to pay for what they get. And so it's $3 a month. You can go to patreon.com/skepticpastor, patreon.com/skepticpastor, and you will receive, you'll be able to be part of the Not Church community. And if it doesn't work for you, just stop paying. It's fine. And if for some reason $3 is not possible for you, you can send me a message, and I'd love to help you get in for free, because we're not trying to be part of the capitalist systemic injustice that preferences people with money for everything, including church. So yeah, I think you'd love it. patreon.com/skepticpastor, patreon.com/skepticpastor. And hey, share this episode with a friend. Give us a review, all the stars, all of that stuff really, really helps. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.